I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Thanks for joining us in an ongoing quest for the awe and the wonder that await each of us every day and all around. Awe can be found in all creation, human or wild, vast or small, in spiritual encounters that move us beyond words. Never assume something small is trivial. A Vermonter by the name of Wilson Bentley didn't. Bentley earned his place in history as the first person to use photography, to be more precise, photomicrography, to capture and document the stunning geometries of tiny individual crystals of snow in their endless variety. He's remembered for having been the first person to find evidence for the idea that no two snowflakes are alike, and then to preach that idea as solid science. Bentley's undying curiosity that was first manifest in boyhood grew into a preoccupation. Then this preoccupation grew into an obsession. For over half a century, his powers of attention were trained on snow. But part of the Wilson Bentley story is that passionate genius often pairs with eccentricity. And as you may have heard, being eccentric frequently exacts a price. Bentley's brand of eccentricity followed that script. He had a rough go of it in society. His biography reveals a man never quite fully accepted by his neighbors and relatives. After all, what kind of an oddball would spend winter after winter, decade after decade, over the course of an entire lifetime, obsessively taking photo after photo after photo of snow? Shooting these pictures was, as I can only imagine, a solitary affair, not suited for group participation, although he was more than happy to show and tell. Sharing with others what he was up to, even trying to light a fire of interest under them. He was known to stage the occasional picture show for his small community, projecting still images of magnified snow crystals onto a bedsheet hanging on the wall.
My neighbors had interest enough to come. I think they found my pictures beautiful. I doubt, though, that they have changed their opinions of me. They still think I'm a little cracked. I've just had to accept that opinion and try not to care. It doesn't hurt me very much.
Which is, of course, to say that it actually did hurt some. Wilson Bentley thought everyone should be just as smitten, just as mesmerized as he, to see the hexagonal crystal structures under magnification. But when it came to observing these miraculous patterns for any real length of time, few people of his acquaintance could ever match his constant wonder. Others just weren't feeling it quite the way he did, so throughout his lifetime, the so-called Snowflake man of Vermont found himself out in the cold for more reasons than just the weather. Born just 2 months before the close of the Civil War, Wilson Bentley was a rural boy. His waking hours were crowded with chickens, dairy cows, wagons, pitchforks, milk jugs, orchards, sawing and chopping firewood, whatever all the things are for a farming family in horse and wagon days. And while small-scale agriculture was to remain his occupation until the end of his life, he also spent countless hours of discretionary time fixated on small-scale science, which is to say, investigating things visible only under a microscope. From the age of 15, when he first gained access to such a device, he seems to have been never more happy than when peering through its lens.
While the other boys were playing with pop guns and slingshots, I was absorbed in studying things under this microscope. Drops of water, tiny fragments of stone, a feather dropped from a bird's wing, a delicately veined petal from some flower. From the very beginning, it was the snowflakes that fascinated me most. Farm folks up in this north country dread the winter, but I was supremely happy from the first snowfall until the last one, which sometimes came as late as May.
Water in its icy, six-sided forms. These flat, lacy, hexagonal solids, so minuscule that only powerful magnification can reveal their stunning symmetry and inconceivable intricacy. It's fair to say Wilson Bentley felt bewitched by all this, and not just in the season of his youth. He would live under snow's spell right up to the week of his death in his 67th year. The mystery of snow haunted him throughout adulthood.
Here is the gem-bestrewn realm of nature, possessing the charm of mystery, of the unknown. What magic is there in the rule of 6 that compels the snowflake to conform so rigidly to its laws?
This was no mere rhetorical question for him. He wondered this straightforwardly and legitimately, unable to take his eyes off the crystals. Wilson Bentley was hardly the first person in history to be captivated by snow. So what exactly did he see that left him so smitten and made him a celebrated figure in history? Well, I've already given the spoiler that he's the person who got us all saying no two snowflakes are identical. That's our usual way of putting it in our attempts to sum him up. But there must have been something more at play than just examining and documenting the structural variations of water turned rigid by winter cold. Most accounts will tell you he was all about the forms or shapes of the magnified crystals. Let's just take a moment here to differentiate in our terminology. Snowflakes are puffballs, little gobs of conjoined crystals. The constituent crystals have this habit, depending on environmental conditions ranging from temperature and humidity to wind and the altitude of the clouds from which they fall, the habit of clumping together, a puffball, as I said. And such a conglomeration may consist of hundreds or even thousands of no longer separate crystals. Whenever we cut a folded piece of paper into a hexagonal snowflake, then hang it on a window or wall as decoration, what we're actually mimicking, to be accurate in an academic sense, is the form of a single crystal, not a flake. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So what we need to do right now is consider the background of his early life that paved the way for Bentley the farm boy to become Bentley the Snowflake Man, or, as he's often simply called, Snowflake Bentley. Jericho, Vermont is a relatively small town even today.
When Bentley was born in 1865, many Vermonters had left either for the West or to enlist for the Civil War. And so the population was, I don't know off the top of my head, but I suspect there was 1,500 people in town, something like that.
Wayne Howe has served as president of the Jericho, Vermont Historical Society, and he's one of Bentley's biggest living fans.
Virtually everybody had, a milk cow and a couple beef cow and a pig kind of thing. And so he had to help with the milking. The barn was across the road. It's no longer there. The house is virtually like it was. In fact, there used to be a little snowflake, which was mounted up on the gable end of the house, and I think that he put up, and I think it's still there. But all those farm chores, they grew potatoes, they had maple syrup, they had a sugar bush, which is where all the maple trees are. He did all those tasks as was expected. His education really consisted of his mom teaching him reading, some math, music. He was actually a musician, and some science. He didn't go to school per se, even though his mother had at one point taught school, but he was homeschooled, as was his brother Charles. So they're doing all their chores, and when he had free time, he was fascinated with nature.
A musician of any real ability can play more than just one note. The more I learn about Bentley, the more I see him as anything but a one-note Johnny. On the contrary, he was well-rounded, literate, hardworking, musical, scientifically minded, affable, and it would pay to remember that snowy winter is hardly Vermont's only season, and throughout his life he applied his microscope to far more than just crystallized H2O. Some of the most intriguing images captured by his camera include a grasshopper immobilized overnight to catch the morning dew, or a spider web also bedecked with pearls of dew. Long before he ever peered into the lens of a microscope, he would ponder the stars and planets of the night sky, or use a telescope by day to observe sunspots. Stories are told of him as a prankster, imitating birdsong convincingly enough to fool his mother, or keeping a red squirrel in a cage, no doubt because squirrels cannot be fully domesticated or trusted, as young Wilson learned one day when he let that wild pet loose. The squirrel promptly climbed his aunt's dress and bit her on the ear. Well, these are just a few details from his early life, but still very helpful windows on his personality. To me, Wilson Bentley seems perfectly relatable, not cracked, as he self-consciously said some people saw him. His lifelong obsession with snowflakes came not at the exclusion of other pursuits in life or other interests, be they in wild nature or in human society. It's just that in the cold months of the year, unlike most other people, he cuddled up most comfortably with snow.
He was really struck by the beauty inherent in these things. When snowflakes fell, he would try to draw them in pencil. And there's a couple pencil drawings that I think they survive of him madly scrambling before they melted, because they turn into water really fast. But he maybe had 300 to 400 drawings. And it was very frustrating because you couldn't preserve them. He loved the beauty of them, and he loved the fact that they told a story somehow. And so he talked his parents, who I can only imagine were quite practical people because they didn't have a lot of money and they lived on a small little homestead, to get him a microscope.
Solemnly standing in the Jericho Center Cemetery is the Bentley family memorial. Polished granite bearing the names of Wilson's parents, Edwin and Fanny on one side, with their sons Wilson and Charles engraved on the other. Then Wilson has his own small stone marker not far away, inscribed very simply, Wilson, Snowflake Man. The mark he made on history came because of his hands-on dedication to taking photographs during snowstorms. Bear in mind that cameras of his day came without any zoom function. Zooming in, that's something I take for granted every day. Also, he got his hands on a microscope well before he had a camera. If everything had stopped with him having just a microscope, I think we wouldn't remember him at all. Bentley's very first microscope was a used instrument dredged up by his mother, the schoolmarm Fanny. It had been within her reach because of her teaching job away from home, but given that she also schooled her own boys privately, her access to a microscope came in handy. This was before the Bentleys shelled out any money for one. I think simple good fortune dropped this device into the hands of just the right 15-year-old. Wilson very quickly developed an insatiable hunger to use it in a particularly odd and most likely unprecedented kind of way, as I said just moments ago, outdoors in snowstorms.
He found if he could put a snowflake on one of these little slides, he would have a more accurate depiction of the snowflake and then could continue drawing.
So drawing was his first method of documentation.
But it wasn't until he was 17 when he got the idea to put a camera and a microscope together.
In the years leading up to getting a camera, young Wilson Bentley with that school microscope had likely put a close eye on anything and everything small, from minerals to insects, mushrooms to berries. What doesn't a kid want to see through a magnifying glass or microscope? You can imagine him scouring the countryside for anything that would fit and hold still on a glass slide. Pine needles, garden seeds, ants and worms if they didn't scurry or wriggle away, maple leaves, blades of grass. Now, photomicrography isn't a term most of us use, and it certainly wasn't a common practice in Bentley's early years. Only a few dozen scientists in the 1800s had really advanced the rare technique by pairing a camera with a microscope, notwithstanding which, it seems that none of their efforts ever involved making images specifically of snow. Bentley is quite clearly the first to have pioneered a process for imaging ephemeral snow crystals in conditions cold enough to prevent them from turning to liquid. I'll describe his setup in just a bit.
Every crystal was a masterpiece of design, and no one design was ever repeated. When the snowflake melted, that design was forever lost without leaving any record behind. I became possessed with a great desire to show people something of this wonderful loveliness, an ambition to become, in some measure, its preserver. Under the microscope, I found that snowflakes were miracles of beauty, and it seemed a shame that this beauty should not be seen and appreciated by others.
As we get deeper into the Snowflake Man's life story and size up his legacy, think about how rare it is for any of us to meet somebody who, over the course of a lifetime, follows a single lodestar. And what if that lodestar is something as trifling as a speck of ice? Those of us who live in snowy places know the tickle of a snowflake landing on the nose, and we know how to brush it off with nary a second thought. Wilson Bentley never could give snowflakes the brush off. They seized him. In other respects, he may have been pretty normal, just a regular small-town New Englander. He was neither a trained scientist, nor a scholar, nor university graduate, nor upper crust. He wasn't what we call urbane. But his mother had been a teacher, after all, and he was plainly literate, as you can tell from the quotations we've already heard from his writings. He played the piano and clarinet, enjoyed neighborhood square dances, planted and dug potatoes, carrots, and cabbage. If the family cows needed milking, he milked them. It's safe to say that for him, the center of the entire cosmos was probably the family farm. The farm was a middle ground between really big and really small things. There was the sky overhead, part of the macrocosmos, and then the world of tiny things that he could magnify. But that first microscope from school would quickly become insufficient to his aims, and the Bentley family was not wealthy. In order to preserve the loveliness of a snowflake, Wilson knew he would have to get a camera and learn how to use it. And he quickly figured out he would need to retrofit it for magnification. His biographer, Duncan Blanchard, wrote that Bentley probably read up on photomicrography. There was a professional photographer named Henry Seeley in the city of Burlington, 10 miles away. Blanchard says, "It seems clear that Seeley introduced Bentley to photography. I got him his first camera," Seeley would later brag, "and showed him the making of plates. And whenever there was a new book published on photography, I used to send it to him." A few dozen individuals had experimented before with various techniques and methods for zooming in. That was during the decades that came right on the heels of the invention of photography. It may seem to us today like a curious omission, but there had been no photographic experiments, at least none that we know of, with snow in particular. A famous British scientist of the late 1600s by the name of Robert Hooke had used a microscope to observe and draw snow crystals, but this was of course long before the advent of photographic cameras. What Bentley needed was an upgrade from the first microscope his mother had provided, and a camera to go with it. If only he could obtain those, he felt confident he could work out some viable way of getting the two devices to work in tandem. He pitched the idea to his parents of buying a second brand-new microscope as well as a camera. High tech in those days, kind of like today, can sometimes be pretty expensive.
It cost, even then, $100. You can imagine, or perhaps you cannot, unless you know what the average farmer is like, how my father hated to spend all that money on what seemed to him a boy's ridiculous whim. Somehow my mother got him to spend the money, but he never came to believe it had been worthwhile.
Everybody else is doing their farm chores. Brother's doing chores, dad's doing chores, mom's doing chores. And he has this sort of esoteric thing going on.
He and my elder brother always thought I was fooling away my time fussing with snowflakes.
After the two big purchases, here's what the fussing actually looked like. According to biographer Duncan Blanchard, Bentley knew he needed to align the camera's field of view with the microscope. That starting point might be obvious to any of us. His new compound microscope, better than the first one, was still the very cheapest made by the Bosch & Lomb Optical Company. The camera model his parents had purchased to go with it was about 7 inches square, but as a bellows camera, it could be stretched out like a concertina to a length of 3 feet. He rigged up these 2 expensive tools on top of a small wooden table about 3 feet high, 1 foot wide, and 2 feet long. And with Yankee ingenuity, he removed the eyepiece from the microscope and likewise the camera lens, and then pushed the 2 together, aligning them along the same axis. At the juncture between the 2, he had to figure out a way to keep things dark inside, to shield the camera's chamber from any infiltration of unwanted light, thus controlling the exposure. He put this whole contraption inside a woodshed that for years would be his working space. Now, the real drama of the whole process was the delicate operation of capturing crystals and transferring them to the microscope slide without damaging them. Outside the shed, under the falling snow, he would let crystals fall on a foot-square board. This he had painted black. Using a simple magnifying glass, he would make an initial survey of his samples, using a turkey feather to sort and sift. He eventually got the knack of looking for the most eye-catching specimens. Holding a wire with a mittened hand, he would transfer a beauty of a crystal to the slide of the microscope, all the while being careful not to exhale warm air on it. You figure that out. In later years, he would boast of having had an exceptionally steady hand, which he attributed to having never used, in his own words, liquor, tobacco, or any stimulants that affect the nerves. You've probably seen images of early photographers standing behind a camera with a black cloth draped over the head to shield the eyes from any unwanted light. Bentley worked no differently, except for a workaround he needed because of a daunting problem. The camera was simply too long for his arms to reach the focusing knob of the microscope, situated way out in front of him. Imagine the frustration of going back and forth again, essentially trying to adjust the focus blindly. To extend his reach, he devised a contraption, a linkage, using a long loop of string, like a drawstring for drapes, but with rotating wooden discs for cranks. His design called for no duct tape or bubble gum. It was, if you will, a precursor to the modern electronic remote. No longer did he need to shuttle back and forth from beneath the head-covering cloth to the microscope. Some of us find it hard enough to adjust a binocular, even when it's held right up against the face. His photographs were taken with natural backlighting from behind a captured crystal that had been positioned on the microscope slide. And exposure time for a single image, after painstaking efforts to focus, could range from 30 to 300 seconds. Trying to figure it all out began in 1883 when he was still just 18 years old. But he didn't get the knack of things that first winter season, which was a great disappointment to him. He wrangled and wrangled with his setup, but even with all his innovation, he just couldn't seem to figure out how to achieve crisp, clear focus. His first great success came mid-January of 1885, well over a year after his first attempt. The day was overcast with nearly half a foot of snow on the ground. He exposed 5 photographic plates, and in a process long lost to most of us in our digital age, he then needed to develop them. Here's Wayne Howe.
When he was developing those plates, he would, I don't know if you recall, but when you develop a negative, you've got to flush things out with water at some point. He would go to the stream, which, oh, by the way, was icy because it was winter, because that's when the snowflakes were available, and rinse out the negatives in this cold brook. So the whole thing, it was kind of a frigid kind of affair.
After fame had come his way, well into adulthood, Bentley would occasionally pose for the media, usually outdoors with his equipment. Famous images show him wearing a winter coat, fedora, thick mittens, poised as if to lean forward and then peer into a microscope, yet with his face mostly in view, his hands holding either a feather or some sort of a wire or stylus, as if he were actually manipulating snow on a glass slide. But these are staged photos. In 1917, the world-renowned Charles Pathé silent film production company arrived at his home in Vermont to make a newsreel segment for later release in movie theaters. By then, Bentley was over 50 years old. The Pathé newsreel is vintage stuff. You can see Bentley going through a few moves, because when the camera's rolling, it's time for action, of course. Although it wasn't even snowing the day of the movie shoot, and the director insisted on having old crusty snow from off the ground tossed out of a second-story window. What's more, the director had no interest in the controlled conditions of the woodshed. Instead, he faked a scene out in the open in full light rather than on the spot where Bentley actually did his work. One more thing. The movie crew made Bentley dress up in his finest, as if going to church. Bentley's biographer, Duncan Blanchard, maintains that all of this inauthenticity must have riled the Snowflake Man considerably. Inauthenticity was the last thing Bentley wanted. He knew his process and his purposes. In fact, authenticity and integrity in his work would come to the fore in a tiny little philosophical dust-up between himself and a German meteorologist, a row that swelled into a long-standing controversy. The seeds of the row were planted actually the very same year the newsreel was made, with a nuanced aspersion that was cast by this scientist, Gustav Hellman, that Bentley had likely touched up his photographs. Before the end of this Constant Wonder episode, we're going to explain where the narrative of fraud, first made so many years ago, has landed today. For the moment, though, just remember that taking the first ever photo of a snow crystal as a 19-year-old farm boy in rural Vermont, this was just plain historic. While yet alive, Bentley did receive honor for his work, internationally even, and he still deserves full credit today. In all likelihood, this stunning historic first, this eureka moment of success, came with no one else around to see it happen. It was a personal, private experience, conducted not in a lab, but in a simple woodshed. And yet the whole story would ultimately prove to be of immense interest to the world. I like to think about what Bentley's emotions must have been as those first images emerged from the wash over his photographic plates as he was developing them by the side of the stream. Now that's the scene Pathé News ought to have reenacted. But at least we have a written description of the event from the only witness, Bentley himself.
The day that I developed the first negative made by this method and found it good, I felt almost like falling on my knees beside that apparatus and worshiping it. I knew then that what I had dreamed of doing was possible. It was the greatest moment of my life.
When sizing up the contributions of Wilson Bentley, people generally focus on this eureka moment, which is really just one part of the whole story. Also on the little factoid that no two flakes are alike. For whatever reason, we tend to like such tidy stories. Commentators will emphasize how his life calling seems to have been galvanized around his collection of snow crystal photographs, and all of that's true. From 1885 onward, he was addicted to them. He could never again resist the urge to catch, isolate, magnify, and photograph these intricate, miniature miracles, as beautiful as any art glass, in a way more beautiful, because they're creations of nature. But Bentley was more than just Mr. Point and shoot, how do we say it, rinse and repeat. He was much more than just a crisp double jeopardy answer. You know, this Vermonter was the first human to photograph crystals of snow, hastily followed by the contestant's buzzer and the winning question, who was Wilson Bentley? Well, there's a far more involved and rich history here. Bentley was also a raindrop man, a northern lights man, a grasshopper photographer. He even spent a season of his life photographing all the various shapes of clouds he could see, and all of it with unflagging interest and curiosity. And then he was a musician, the occasional prankster, a citizen scientist, and above all, as the evidence suggests, he was a wanderer. We'll keep pressing against the usual stereotyping of Wilson Bentley as Constant Wonder continues. I'm Marcus Smith. I want to recommend another BYU radio podcast that I think you'll really enjoy. It's called Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. It's brand new and it has video as well as audio. If you're someone who wants to engage with others on important topics, but you're not sure just how, or maybe you're burned out on social media and you wish you could bring some humanity back into discussions in real life, maybe still online, maybe not, well then Uncomfy is for you. You're going to hear real people describing challenging moments when they decided to stick with the discomfort, and in the process, they found some community healing or learned how to talk about what matters to them or simply discovered greater empathy in their relationships with others. And you can do it too. New episodes of Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us, drop every Wednesday, and you can listen or watch on the BYU Radio app or wherever you get your podcasts. Washington, D.C., Princeton, New Jersey, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Montreal. These are just some of the cities Wilson Bentley would eventually visit during his lifetime, on tours to publicize his findings, which is mostly to say his photographs. Yes, he was intensely interested in the mysterious mechanisms of snow crystal formation. He speculated, for instance, that the shape, dimension, and behavior of the crystals possibly had to do with such variables as temperature, humidity, and the like. But answering these difficult scientific questions in any experimentally definitive way was never really his domain. So at day's end, was he a scientist or a photographer? Where's the boundary between just collecting raw data and the endeavor of subsequent interpretation and experimentation that are so crucial to scientific advancement? In short, was Bentley a bona fide scientist?
He was definitely a scientist, maybe not by training, but by sort of nature. He was just looking at things and trying to understand what he saw.
That's Ken Libbrecht, a physicist at the California Institute of Technology who specializes in the molecular dynamics of crystal growth from water vapor. In other words, the science of snowflakes. Libbrecht's books include The Snowflake, Winter's Frozen Artistry, The Secret Life of a Snowflake, and Ken Libbrecht's Field Guide to Snowflakes. If you want to see some utterly mind-blowing time-lapse videos of snow crystals he has grown under controlled conditions in the lab, be sure to check out his website, snowcrystals.com. I promise you'll be glad you did. It's likely you've already seen some of Libbrecht's work without even knowing it, because 4 of his snowflakes ended up as the material depicted on approximately 3 billion postage stamps during the 2006 holiday season.
Once you start photographing, you want to go and do some more because they're all different. Every time it snows, you're like, wow, I wonder if I can get an even better one now.
He totally gets the obsession that Wilson Bentley lived with. Not all of Libbrecht's photographs are of artificial crystals grown in the lab.
You have to catch them as they're falling and somehow get that under a microscope. For most of human history, people did not know how rainbows worked. You see them, and they're colorful, they're beautiful. And over centuries, people slowly figured out optics and how sunlight is reflected and refracted by raindrops, and the light dispersion makes rainbows. And that was really figured out in like the 1600s. And we understand the optics almost perfectly. But with snow crystals, we are just not there yet. We are 400 years behind. It's a complicated phenomenon, and we're really just starting to kind of pick it apart.
Ken Libbrecht has made significant contributions in this area, but a little off to the side of his research, when it comes to his efforts to help us remember Wilson Bentley's legacy, he has had an important hand in undoing damage that was done to Bentley's reputation. Well before the days of Photoshop, Bentley had been made out to be a Photoshopper. In order to understand how his name got besmirched, first you need to know how it was that Bentley managed to garner international attention in the first place. You've already heard how he tried, with only tepid success, to persuade his neighbors to care about snow crystals. Getting his parents to buy the necessary tools in the beginning, well, that had been the first vital step toward his career in the photomicrography of snow. The second major step came when at long last he got his images before the eyes of a scholar who would become his enthusiastic advocate, a professor by the name of George Henry Perkins. In later years, Bentley would recall how before going to Perkins, he had felt stymied. "I wanted to share my treasures with somebody," he wrote, "and I couldn't." Or when he could, nobody was willing to say more than, "Well, that's kind of nice." Perkins changed that game. He was amazed to see Bentley's work and graciously mentored Bentley's efforts to get photos into print for the very first time. These appeared in Appleton's Popular Science Monthly in 1898 in an article titled "A Study of Snow Crystals." Although Perkins authored the text to accompany the photos by Bentley, Perkins honored the Jericho inventor and photographer, insisting right in the article, "The facts, theories, and illustrations are entirely due to Bentley's untiring and enthusiastic study of snow crystals." This article, his first great public success, was a calling card that opened other doors of opportunity. In 1898, the Harvard Mineralogical Museum mounted a public exhibition of his snow crystal photomicrographs. 2 years later, in 1900, Popular Science News published 3 short Bentley articles, one about crystals, one on frost, and one on raindrops. And 1901 saw the publication of a full-page profile of Bentley's work. That appeared in the Monthly Weather Review, an official publication of the U.S. Weather Bureau. And it was likely with the help of the Weather Bureau that he was invited to exhibit at the 1901 Buffalo, New York World's Fair, known as the Pan American Exposition, the most important scientific and cultural exposition that had ever been held in the United States up to that time. For all of this fame, though, it's bittersweet to note that throughout his adult life, Bentley sold snow crystal prints of his photographs, each a 3-inch square, for 5 cents apiece, and he never came even close to turning a profit. All the losses were covered by farm work. About that accusation of tampering with the photos, once Bentley's photographs had caught the attention of the industrial world, a certain meteorologist by the name of Gustav Hellmann took a wee bit of umbrage. Whether it was professional envy or just simple feedback one should always expect in the world of scientific scholarship and exchange, this Hellmann at first offered what seemed almost like a mere passing remark. This was in a German-language article translated into English for the Monthly Weather Review. Historian Duncan Blanchard describes how Hellmann's article maintained that Bentley's photomicrographs were, quote, "very numerous, but some unfortunately much retouched," end quote. That was the whole comment. Along with the translated article, however, the editor appended a footnote countering this charge of retouching, and the whole thing might have ended there. Blanchard wrote in his biography of Bentley, "With the United States Weather Bureau vouching for your honesty, what more needs to be said?" There are several twists and turns to this tale, but even as recently as a Radiolab podcast from 2012, an episode titled Crystal Bliss, that allegation of retouching photographs, well, it was still in the air. What was Bentley's actual method in preparing his final prints, and was that method honest? In our current age of AI and fake news, it's just not hard for us to appreciate this early example of a public figure's integrity being called into question, held up to the light for examination. Ken Libbrecht.
He was trying to sort of demonstrate how beautiful they were. He was not trying to get an unbiased sample. He was choosing the most beautiful crystals. And then he did a little old-day photoshopping by scraping away the emulsion a little bit, but mostly that was to make them presentable. Nowadays, every Snowflake photographer does some amount of editing on the pictures because usually got a little dust in the picture. Why do you want that in there? So you take it out. But that's not the same as Rod. I mean, he really was selecting the most beautiful, in his opinion, or the most interesting snow crystals, and he photographed them with as high a fidelity as he could using his equipment. There's nothing wrong with that. And he admitted that. He never tried to hide it. And others have said, well, I went out to look for snowflakes like that. I never saw any because they don't look like that. And that's correct, too. When you just put out a piece of cardboard and look at what falls, you will find that mostly you see pretty ragged looking, broken up, just not terribly attractive crystals. And in particular, they often do not have this beautiful, perfect, near perfect symmetry that a lot of Bentley's photographs show. Bentley did what I and other snowflake photographers do to this day, is that he looked at all these pictures, looked at all the crystals falling from the sky, and he said, oh, that one looks really, really nice. And he picked that one up and photographed it. And he didn't photograph all the other ones. So, no one likes to look at those other ones so much. So he did his best to find and document these especially fantastic symmetrical crystals. That's not a representative sample. He never said it was, but he did show us what was out there. And lots of people have photographed snowflakes since then and have found very similar things to what he had seen. So yeah, there's nothing fraudulent about it. He was just, he was acting like a photographer.
Wilson Bentley left behind a treasure trove of images generated over the course of 47 consecutive winters. When he took the very last shot of his entire lifetime, he had a total collection of 5,381 photomicrographs of snow crystals, each one gingerly captured, expertly selected during the best storms, of course, and developed in the old manner decades before the digital age. He took great satisfaction in his crowning achievement in print, the 1931 large format volume titled, quite simply, Snow Crystals, co-authored by Dr. W.J. Humphreys, a meteorological physicist with the United States Weather Bureau. Ken Libbrecht has been sufficiently dismayed by those lingering mentions of fraud behind any of these images that he personally sprang into action once to clear Bentley's name. The National Science Foundation, as it turned out, had produced and posted a video online that included prominent mention of the Snowflake Man right along with the old aspersion. Libbrecht says that the video played up the allegation of fraudulent retouching.
And it kind of irked me. And so I went to the end of the video and there were some credits, and I figured out who I could contact, and I said, you've done the man a disservice. I mean, first of all, he's an American icon. So you can't just diss him like that, not so readily. And also, they just had it wrong. I mean, he was not fraudulent in any way. And I explained it to them. I gave them a lot of credit. They didn't quite understand what the story was. And so I told them, and they said, wow, we got to change that. So they kept the video more or less, but they changed the voiceover, and they retold the story and edited the video to put Bentley in just a much better light. They said, he had selected these, the nicest crystals, and that's what you see in his book. I thought I was, tilting at windmills to try to get them to change something that had already been, finished and published, but they did, because it's the National Science Foundation. They're a class organization, so they wanted to get it right.
Wilson Bentley's public legacy has numerous facets, obviously not quite as many as a single crystal with all of its beveled facets. Still, so very much good falls to Bentley's credit, and we haven't even touched on his photography of clouds, his fascination with the aurora borealis, or his attempts to capture raindrops in pans of ground flour in a process to assess their size. The mainstay of his interest, until the day he died, was snow.
Bentley was really responsible for people's first awareness that snowflakes came in such a variety of different shapes and such complexity and symmetry. People just hadn't documented that much before, and he started taking pictures, and it really caught everybody's attention.
And that right there has become the main Bentley talking point, his best remembered contribution. Important, yes, but far from the whole story because of the other many gifts he left us. It may not even be the best part. Allow me to guide you through what I mean. Children who grow up in modern-day Jericho, Vermont, get to be justly proud of the local figure now rehabilitated from oddball to hero. Ask most any Jericho kid who goes to a Jericho school, about Snowflake Bentley. They know about him.
He proves that it's more than just like stuff coming from the sky. They're little snow crystals that are unique to themselves.
Well, I admire how he was always trying over and over, even though people were like, why are you trying that again? It's useless. I enjoy how he would always take nature pictures, and the snowflakes just looked like they were in a fantasy, but I knew that they were real because he made a whole book of all of his snowflakes.
Those are the voices of Anna and Juniper, elementary schoolers living, as I said, in Jericho today. And if he were alive, Wilson Bentley would be astounded to know that there are school kids all across the country who know about him. Like this teenager named Seth in the Rocky Mountains who loves to ski the backcountry.
I look at avalanches and avalanche stability reports. The shape of the snowflakes can greatly impact stability, and I think it's so cool that Snowflake Bentley was the first person to ever look into the shape of snowflakes.
Embark on a whimsical journey with The Appleseed and host Sam Payne. It's one of many shows from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. Wrap yourself in captivating stories, expertly woven by talented storytellers. You'll hear live studio audiences taking immense delight in a broad tapestry of tales, some humorous, others poignantly reflective. The Appleseed is always a family-friendly experience. It sparks imagination creative enough to make fiction feel like fact and bring real-life events back to life. The Appleseed. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. How many of us are likely to be remembered after 100 years, not just by scholars and historians, but by teens and preteens who might take you to be a positive role model? That's an accomplishment worthy of admiration. But the goods don't end there. Not at all. I'm about to offer more food for thought about this unusual legacy, including something that few have ever mentioned, but is more than perfect for a podcast about constant wonder. I'm Marcus Smith. The shape of snowflakes. Cool and amazing, no two alike. That's a textbook summary of Bentley's legacy, especially the way he gets described in a STEM-dominated, technologically oriented society. But what if, in addition to phenomena we can observe and assess under a microscope and describe with the language of science, what if there's something to feel? I'm not talking temperature. I'm not talking about praising Bentley as a paradigm and paragon of grit and persistence. That's all very time-honored messaging, most often given in the interest of moral education and character development. We do indeed like our hardy pioneers, don't we? And Bentley was indisputably one. But do we, all of us, including school children, relate in any way to what Bentley was feeding on spiritually, or perhaps what it was that was eating at him existentially? We might well choose to reflect on this passion of his awe, to understand why he was so driven to engage as he did with nature, with creation. Bentley never had any formal scientific training, but in no way does that disqualify him as a witness of wonder. Holding him to the expectation of expertise, well, maybe that's just barking up the wrong tree altogether. You see, on the one hand, there's a kind of wonder that compels us to scratch a cerebral itch. But there's a second kind of wonder. It has a different character, I think, than the mere collection of raw data.
New and beautiful designs seem to be as numerous now as when I began the work 40 years ago. While many of them are very similar one to another, I have as yet found no exact duplicates. In this inexhaustible storehouse of crystal treasures, what a delight is in store for all future lovers of snowflakes and of the beautiful in nature.
If you're looking for somebody emblematic of constant wonder for your podcast, it's him. He had that constant wonder. Bentley worked with what he had And he found awe and wonder right there in the farmyard, in the dooryard. Awe can be found right in front of you. There's been lessons in my life as I've gotten older. That's where you find beauty, not in some idealized circumstances, but in your present circumstances.
There's so much more to this farmer from Vermont than usually gets said. And Bentley's very own words routinely make my case for me. In his reportage about his experiences, he can never fully mask his personal excitement, even when he's trying his level best to sound dispassionate. He's just not convincing in the role of the staid, emotionally detached, empirical observer. He can't disguise himself. For a prime example, here's a passage where he's trying to keep things buttoned down, but you can hear the places where he leans quite heavily into rhapsodic expression.
Every snowflake has an infinite beauty which is enhanced by knowledge that the investigator will, in all probability, never find another exactly like it. Consequently, photographing these transient forms of nature gives to the worker something of the spirit of a discoverer. Besides combining her greatest skill and artistry in the production of snowflakes, nature generously fashions the most beautiful specimens on a very thin plane, so that they are specially adapted for photomicrographical study.
Wayne Howe sees Bentley's emotional writing as an honest stamp of good character. His heart is revealed by his words.
The grace that is offered by awe is throughout his work. He's not writing to pick things apart or get really specific about things. He's writing about the wondrous feelings that these snowflakes create for people. It's part and parcel of his whole being.
I've saved what I think is the best for last, in a couple of passages where Bentley unabashedly declares, with near religious fervor, why these tiny frozen flakes mean so much to him.
The snow crystals come to us not only to reveal the wondrous beauty of the minute in nature, but to teach us that all earthly beauty is transient and must soon fade away. But though the beauty of the snow is evanescent, like the beauties of the evening sky, it fades but to come again. Oh, for 1,000 hands, 1,000 cameras to preserve more of this exquisite beauty so lavishly scattered over the earth. And yet there should be no despair. For this miracle, like unto the miracle of spring's awakening, will come and come again for all time, either here or somewhere in the universe. For beauty and life and love are eternal, the things that make the universe worthwhile and justify its existence.
Thanks to Wayne Howe and Ken Libbrecht for joining with us in this episode. Howe has served as the president of the Jericho, Vermont Historical Society, and Libbrecht is a Caltech physicist. Passages from various writings by Wilson Bentley himself were read by Rod Gustafson. We're also indebted to the folks at snowflakebentley.com. They gave us permission to use an archival photo of Bentley as he's standing before his microscope. To learn much more about Bentley's life, I highly recommend Duncan Blanchard's biography. It's titled The Snowflake Man. There's also a marvelous illustrated book for children by Jacqueline Briggs Martin, illustrated by Mary Azarian, and that one's titled Snowflake Bentley. This episode was produced with assistance from Tenery Taylor and Lydia McElroy. I'm Marcus Smith. Our thanks to you for listening. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio.